All right. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to another E&G broadcast on BIM topics for the construction industry. Today, I'm going to be joined by two experts who will be presenting and discussing some of their key learnings and practices around the pre-construction process and also the BIM coordination, and how to use early and clear communications, to prevent those costly reworks and schedule, extensions. Eliminate as many delays as possible. Real quickly, the topics we're going to discuss today will cover a wide range, really around the whole coordination process, including the issues that you're going to address and have to deal with, what to be aware of during the whole coordination process, and then really how to plan, what to look out for, and how to plan to avoid some of those rework and other issues and redesigns that can happen. All right, we want to keep it kind of casual today, and we do have a lot of content to present, but if we can, we'll keep questions. We want to take questions, keep them toward the end, and open it up to whatever questions that you might have around the experiences of the folks here. So quick intro, who's on the call. I'm Jay Berryhill. I'm the CRO of E&G. We've got Antonio, who is a BIM coordinator and one of our leaders with a lot of professional and industry experience. And we've got Chris Tierney, the EVP, Executive Vice President of All Trades Mechanical. A little bit about the companies that are represented here today. E&G, we are a BIM services company helping MEP contractors all around the United States and North America. We've got over 600 VDC BIM specialists. We cover a wide range of customers, from the largest contractors and partners in the US to local MEP contractors that are just getting into the BIM industry. We've been around for 18 years. We are very proud of the fact that most of our customers are repeat, and we have a very, very high NPS, customer satisfaction score. We've got offices across the US, and we work all US working hours. So Chris, tell us a little bit about All Trades Mechanical, and then kick it off for us.
All Trades, we're a company. We were incorporated in 2014. A group of industry professionals kind of came together and built All Trades into what it is. We all came from some varying, parts of the mechanical and construction industry to kind of bring together an overall company that encompassed a lot of different areas. We focus on the Eastern Pennsylvania and the New Jersey markets, although we do some projects outside of that territory, just as long as they fit our kind of core profile. We are a union contractor. We've got roughly 100 union tradespeople in the field. We hire out of multiple union halls, pipe fitters, plumbers, millwrights, ironworkers, laborers, operating engineers, boilermakers. So pretty much any trade that kind of falls into our world on the projects that we're on. So there's quite a bit of them. And then again, we try to specialize or focus more on the industrial world, the healthcare, pharmaceutical, educational, or higher ed, and then some heavy commercial markets. We don't really do a whole lot of residential work, although we do see a lot more mixed use projects coming to life, which kind of blend the residential market with a commercial market. Jay, next slide. So some of the things we want to try to cover today, just general topics, I guess, to try to broach on, is one of the issues that we see come across a lot now is how BIM coordination kind of goes beyond traditional spattle coordination, or moving things around, and ends up becoming a redesign process in projects. So we want to talk a little bit about that. We want to try to highlight some of the root causes that drive those design changes, so you can identify them a little bit earlier. We want to share just some real project insights or strategies that we kind of believe in or see that maybe helps to try to mitigate some of those issues.
Right.
All right. So the big question, we get to the root of the problem. What is coordination? Sounds simple. It's probably not the most simple thing to define. And really, what is redesign, and where does that line kind of fall? So these are they're common terms, they're kind of vague statements. And again, I think if you poll a lot of people, they'll give you a lot of different answers. I don't know that any one answer is right or wrong, but we try to give you a kind of a guidelines that we believe in, and you guys can make determinations on your projects or on your in the platform you're working on to see where you kind of fall. Next slide. So first thing we always do, or I always do, is I always go to, what do I owe? I'm a contractor. I have contracts. Contracts say things. We always kind of go default to that. That's the basis of where we start with. So with that being said, we kind of went through a couple contracts. We pulled a few statements out that we see in contracts to kind of give you some of the language that we see come across as what coordination is. Coordination as required, probably the most common one we see. Pretty vague in my opinion, but it's in a lot of our contracts. It's written there. Contract drawings are diagrammatic in nature. Coordination as required to make constructible. That's one of the ones I see a lot. I kind of think about that one. It sounds a little bit more than just coordination, but that's kind of what's written as our scope. And then I pulled a favorite one of mine out that says subcontractor will fully cooperate and coordinate its work with the work of others, other trades, including but not limited to the review of trade shop drawings for impacts. Which to me, I think about that, and it doesn't really sound like coordination to me. So with that being said, I say, well, we know what the contract says. What do we expect, or what do we go into a project assuming we're going to do in coordination? So general assumptions, high level stuff, where we're at. So in my opinion, and in my industry experience, we believe that we assume the general locations that are provided for things are acceptable. Somebody's going to identify, we're going to put something in a room or on a roof or in a building. The location has been vetted out. We assume that general location is good. We assume that what you want to put in there, the basis of design components, it fits, it works, it's okay. You're not trying to put an outdoor component inside. You're not trying to put an inside component outside, size-wise, stuff like that. It works. And then we assume that the IFC documents issued for construction documents show the bulk of the work necessary to perform the project. So again, we understand there's design build, there's design assist, there's lump sum, there's all different kind of platforms which we work within, but as it goes to, for IFC or construction related documents, you assume that the bulk of what you're getting shows the bulk of the work, and you're not really trying to figure out all these other things that don't exist. There could be a little bit there, but you own a working system. We hear that a lot, but for the most part, that should be a minimal item.
There's always things to learn in that process.
Yeah. So, with that, I'm going to kind of turn it over to Antonio, and he's going to kind of go through some of the examples that we believe, and he'll run through some stuff for you to give you some real world stuff.
All right. Basically just true examples of coordination, little things, changing elevations, adding components, shifting components, modifying design a little bit within reason, and then adding detail because of the LOD. Jay, next slide for me. Yeah, side by side. Okay. The left is the design, the right is the install. As you can see, it didn't really change too much, but it did change. We added added fittings. Looks like the penetration shifted closer to the beam. Elevation changes. Overall, it pretty much stayed the same, but it did change, but it's well within our scope. Overall, I would say the only thing I would talk about this is a confirming RFI, maybe to verify the penetrations, because it did shift to accommodate for the duct penetrations. See, next slide for me.
Hey, Antonio, real quick, what tips can you give the folks on the call, or anyone in the trade, on how to foresee some of these issues? Anything that comes to idea around that?
One of the big things I do at the beginning of a project is I overlay a few of the trades, just so I can sort of pinpoint some trouble spots, sort of narrow my focus, and then I can dig a little bit deeper. But if you take that at the beginning of the project and just glance at a few things, overlay in a PDF viewer, it might help you focus. Say this one.
Jay, yeah, jump back if you can jump back some slopes.
Yeah,
so
let me come back. Sorry,
guys.
guys.
Kind of go through some stuff that we think doesn't really fall into coordination. That's really more redesign.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this one's again side by side. The left is design, the right is the install. Two FCU units. Let's see. Looks like the one in the hallway shifted into the room, so the right one had to shift as well because of the congestion in the hallway. So again, shifting, moving components, that's something that needs to be addressed. It's
And
redesign.
to try to point this out, this is a project that Antonio and I worked on together. I mean, these moves aren't by choice, they're by necessity. And I think that's a good point to make. You know, as a contractor, we move things out of choice sometimes to make it better for us or make it more reasonable. A lot of times you're forced into moving things out of necessity because where they're necessarily at doesn't work, or once you start to develop it, you find that it just can't be there. So this is a good example of something that moved out of necessity versus something that moved out of choice.
Got it. All right.
Okay, this one, an FCU as well. This one's fairly big, so it was located in the far right corner in that smaller room. And as you can see, there's way too much congestion in that room for it to fit. So they had to drop the pipe to go below the steel. So again, total relocation. You know, look at the size, look at the access zones, things like that. So
And
has to fit
for the
within the
purpose of
structure.
coordination versus redesign, it's also something to consider. I mean, we talk MEP, full circle, moving a component from mechanicals may impact electrical and plumbing and everybody else. It's not just the activity, what you're going to do to move or redesign your stuff. It's also the chain events of the chain reaction that occurs when you start moving things to what it does for everybody else, which needs to be considered in that overall concept.
Got it.
Okay, next one for me. Okay, another FC unit as well. You shifted from out of the corridor. So if you look, the access zone you wouldn't be able to access this unit in that corridor. So it had totally shift again to the right because of the access. So new
And some
location.
of those things come into, we go back to the contract documents and say, what do you own? And this, a job like this, they'll tell you own, constructible documents per the code. Well, codes may require electrical clearances, things like that, that aren't considered in the design. Now, is that a coordination item or is that a design item? And this is a good example of like an electrical code issue that you could not have, you couldn't have achieved based on where they showed the unit.
Yeah, and because of this one shifted, they had to up the size of the duct, catch those two taps on the left. So it's not just the movement of the unit, it changes more than that. So okay, next one for me, Jay. This one was it's important that RFAs are accurately. So if you look at the left one, it's just the design RFA, and the right one's the accurate one. So next slide for me, Jay. If you look at this one, next slide. Okay, the left one is the design. So in the design, we only have supply, return, and the exchange underneath with all that steel. If you look at the right, we had to add two other trades. We had to add drain and we had to add makeup water. So new trades, added scope. Again, it's going to add fittings. It's going to add penetrations. It's just going to add a bunch of stuff. Those are all things we need to look at. Okay, next one for me, Jay. Again, this one, same thing. Accurate RFIs. We need to take the time to look at those things. This is your heat exchangers, different sizes, different depths, pad size changes, rotation, pumps moved, all because the accurate RFAs. And with this, I'll pass back over to Chris.
Hey, Antonio, a quick question that came in. Some changes are like just in coordination. Others require like discussions, approval. Which do you know is which?
For me, I set little rules for myself. When if it shifts from one room to another in ductwork, that's a design change for me. But also when you're dealing with equipment, you're thinking of size, weight, pad size. If it's affecting any of that, we really need to look at that and say, hey, it's a discussion. If we have to talk about it more than once, obviously there's an issue.
Yeah.
So.
So we identify there's obviously a question, problem, concern, something that comes up on a lot of different projects. So again, it's easy to identify the issue. So let's just talk about solutions. And the goal or the hope is to always minimize problems, minimize issues, minimize anything, because nobody wants to solve them after their problems. So some of that we want to talk about is some concepts you can do to try to mitigate some of them or kind of head them off at the pass. And these are some solutions concepts. Again, not all inclusive, high level, some things you guys can think about going into projects to try to give you, a little bit of a head start on doing on resolving issues. I'll cover these in a little bit more depth, but just to run through the list to a high level. I mean, obviously, earlier engagement with design teams, pre-construction, we all know that we believe in it, but really you want to focus on when. Utilization of real data and components, a big item that we think we should talk about. Determine design parameters and logistical issues during the initial design and prior to coordination efforts. We'll cover that a little bit. Engage installers for access requirements, constructability issues before the initial design. Again, common theme, trying to do things before the design is finalized. And then again, enforce proper documentation throughout the process so that whatever you come up with is clean. So let's just dive into them a little bit and give you a little bit better idea of what we mean by these. All right. Pre-construction. We've all seen it. We all hear about it. We talk about it. Not every project allows for it, but for the most part, and Jay, it'll pop up, I guess, in a second, but simple bar chart. We talk about pre-construction. It's not as much what you do. It's really when you do it. And one of the things we talk about trying to do things is do things right the first time. So pre-construction is an attempt to try to get those efforts done early in the design process before the documents are generated, before you bid the jobs, before you go through all those efforts, get that stuff done in with the conceptual design and not necessarily after everything's already been issued. So really what we want to focus on the pre-construction is not necessarily that you're doing it, but when you're doing it. Do it as early as possible to get the maximum returns for your pre-construction efforts. We think it propagates throughout the whole project, saves schedule, saves time, minimizes the amount of questions you got to deal with during the course of the coordination efforts. Second concept. Utilizing real data and components. So we all know we bid jobs, we get jobs. We don't always know what we're going to use. We haven't gone through the purchasing process. We haven't gone through the submittal process. Maybe we haven't, figured everything out. So we believe that the earlier you can incorporate real components into the design, the better off you'll be. Because again, not knowing what you're building to and putting a box in there isn't really going to make a lot of sense in trying to do things. And we go back to trying to avoid having to redo things because it's redesign in my mind. That's not coordination. Good example here is an air-cooled chiller, relatively simple piece of equipment, relatively common, but based on the manufacturer, my connections might be in a different location. The unit might be a different size. The control panel may be in a different location. It'll affect conduit, clearances, all those types of things. So this is an example of a real model we got from a vendor that told us exactly what we need to pipe to, so we don't have to go back and rework everything after we initially draw it. So a good example of trying to find a real data component that you want to incorporate into your initial design, into your pre-coordination efforts.
Right.
Next concept, Jay. All right, so determine design parameters and logistical issues in the initial design. So what do we mean by that? So understand what you're going to be governed by, understand what you're going to be held to. So code requirements for a project. What are the code requirements? ASME, ANSI, local jurisdiction code requirements, electrical codes. Understand the code version, what the specific requirements are in those codes. So know that going into the project so you can build that into the design. Project specific specifications. We've all bid jobs. We all get these packages specs that are 2,000 pages long and it's got everything under the sun. We really try to drive to project specific specifications. And with that, we really are talking about trying to get into specs that are really designed for that job and for that job only. Jay's jumping ahead on me. He's going to check to see how well I know my slides.
Sorry about that.
So just we'll see if you can roll back one more for me, Jay. I don't have them all memorized, but
Well, hang on, let me see. Are we caught up? Have we caught up
there
here?
we go. Safety
Okay.
considerations, a big item. We often talk about it too late in the process after coordination's been done. It's usually a function of the construction people telling you what they need for safety or the owner telling you what he needs for his long-term safety. So we want to think about those things early in the job or early in the design process, make sure they're built in. Owner requests for clearances or access. The owner's going to live with this building for however long they are. Their request should be considered whenever possible. Sometimes we think we have enough space to do something. The owner may need more space, may want more space, or he may have a long-term plan for the facility that we don't know about. fork trucks or equipment or whatever it ends up being. So you want to figure that stuff out in the initial design so that you don't have to worry about trying to add it in after the fact. And then lastly, space or access limitations. This is a big item that we often don't see in the initial design process that we want to get incorporated there, because more often than not, those things don't come up till the end or after the design's done, and they create a lot of havoc. And Jay's going to jump to the next slide, give you a good example from a project we had.
Chris, can you give an example of that?
Yep. Next slide, I'll give you a good example. And it's a real life project we had. It was a stadium where we were trying to build a structure underneath the bleacher seatings, and the engineer picked all this equipment and we designed a building and we placed all that stuff on the roof. And then at the end, we kind of got the access requirements for the unit. And you can kind of see from this unit, which was green, the access requirements kind of put me into all the structure and into the backside, which just made it not possible. And we didn't really identify that till late in the process because we didn't really know what those access requirements were going to be. So when we plugged them in, we found that basically everything we had done for these units wouldn't work. And we then had to go back into a redesign process based on access requirements that, had we known them early in the job, we might have either changed the equipment, changed the location, identified the concern to the engineer, and or should he have known this stuff early in the equipment selection? Probably, but you want to pull that stuff out before you do the drafting, not after you do the drafting. Next concept. Engage installers for access requirements and constructability. So I'm a contractor. We have a lot of installers. Those installers have a lot of opinions and knowledge and insight that maybe somebody in an office doesn't always have. So we often try to bring them in or get them involved in some of this stuff. So things that we talk about: clearance requirements for rigging and installation. If I can't physically get that piece of or component where it needs to go, it doesn't matter that it fits in this space. It doesn't matter that it's the right piece. If you can't get it in there, it doesn't solve a problem. You got to work that stuff out usually in the construction process and or move it. So that's a big item. Piece size limitations. We see this come up a lot. Again, renovations, existing facilities. What can you physically get in the space? Know what those piece size limitations are and know that you've selected stuff that works, because again, sometimes you can choose an alternate manufacturer or an alternate piece that may be smaller, maybe breaks down. You want to know that stuff going into the design process, not try to figure it out after you're done, figure out how to make it work. Egress pass, overhead clearance, another big item. You may not see that in the coordination effort, but you may find out in the construction process that needs an egress path, it needs head clearances. Those are items that you often find late in the process that cause you to go back into the design. Again, going back into what we talk about as redesign as opposed to coordination. So we want to identify those things early, build them into the model, make sure they're there, make sure the design works around them and not necessarily tries to incorporate them after the fact. Access for service. We kind of talked about that a little bit. Access for service is always a tricky one. What do you really need? What's required by code? What does somebody want versus what can we give them? But again, make considerations for whatever you can. These are big items that often move equipment after the fact because you don't really have the service access, or someone, the owner ultimately says, this isn't going to work for us. We need you to do something. And nobody really wants to go back to the owner and say that their need or want has a cost associated with that kind of stuff. And my last one, and I bring this as to me, a hot button, is frequency of access for an item. Again, not everything can be the most important thing. Not everything can be the thing you're going to touch every day. You got to really prioritize in tight spaces what you need to get to or what you have to get to. And we use the example of a valve that's going to be operated once a year versus a valve that's going to be operated every day. That guy doesn't mind climbing up into the ceiling once a year as much as he's going to mind climbing up into the ceiling every day. So start to think about those things before you do the design. If I have to make a choice between these 2 or 3 components, which one's going to be the most critical to the job? Put a little bit of thought into that, because that may help you in the long run not get a request to, hey, can you move this or can you change that, or I can't get to this. So we want to think about that before the design process, which is kind of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, I would say taking the time to really look at the equipment, chillers, the door swing, how much space you need to change the coils, a boiler has a huge door swing, things like that.
Yeah, and engineers don't always have that information and or figure that into their design.
Yep.
Next slide, Jay. And last but not least, we want to enforce proper documentation. So what does that mean? To me, That's not necessarily generating change orders or generating letters. It's really just trying to take all the thoughts and concepts, document them, and make sure that they're distributed, because sometimes the best ideas don't get heard by all or don't get incorporated, and they don't really exist. So how do we generate documentation on our projects? Obviously, RFI, request for information. It's a good document or a tool that you can use to document the concern or problem and or document the solution. When it's documented, you can distribute it. You can make sure everybody understands it, gets it. Not everybody's going to be in the meetings. Not everybody's going to review the issues. It's a good way to get that information out to the project. I'm a big believer in producing project-specific details and drawings. So what does that mean to me? That means when I generate a document or a building or whatever it is, make it project-specific. So if I ask Antonio, hey, pipe up this air handler for me, I want to make sure I'm giving him what I really want and not some generic detail that he's going to draw and I'm going to modify it 4 times for him to redraw it or take components out or add components in. So spend the time to figure out what those project-specific details are before you do the drawings, before you draw it. Again, the concept, do it right the first time, not redo it. Update documents to be issued for construction. We all sit in meetings, coordination meetings. Not everybody's in them. You want to make sure that whatever you guys come up with in the coordination or redesign process gets it into the construction process, because more often than not, if that information doesn't make it out to the field or out to the guys physically putting the work in, they might not do it right. And you may find that that same issue then surfaces again in construction. So document it, update your documentation, make sure that documentation exists and is accessible for people. It's a big item. Document changes in meetings and minutes. We know not everybody sits through coordination meetings, not every owner's in items, CMs, you miss things, you can't be involved in every meeting all the time. So the best chance you have is you document the meetings, document the minutes, identify them, make them clear, concise, don't overload anybody, but get all that information out to whoever wants it or needs it. Meeting minutes and stuff like that's a good way to try to disseminate that for people that may not have been involved in those conversations. A big one for me, save old versions of design for reference. We've all been involved in projects. We look at a design document a year or 2 from ago, and we look at where we're at, and they're different, and we don't remember why we ended up with what we ended up. So we believe that the path to the final solution tells a lot, and it's how you got there. And sometimes you might not remember why we moved something or why it's in a different room or why it's on the roof. But if you have the reference documents that move through there, you can then follow the thought process or the path for where it is. And maybe there was a concept you forgot that you needed to incorporate or move, and that that gets identified. So it's good to have those old versions. It's also good to use that as a reference for the efforts or the work done. When we start talking about redesign, we start talking about getting compensated for those things. It helps to show people that multiple iterations that you went through to go from A to B, because sometimes it's a tough understanding of what was necessary. And then my last and most important one to me is have the changes reviewed by the design team or whomever is in charge or whoever's involved. Because I sit in a meeting, I have a great concept, I think it's perfect, it fits the solution. Antonio agrees, he tells me it's a great solution. We run with it, we go out there, we make all these great changes, and before you know it, neither one of us thought about something that somebody else thought about. And we drew it once, we changed it, we drew it again to fix it what we thought, and we created a new problem. And then we got to draw it a 3rd time, as opposed to making sure that everybody understands what those fixes or those concepts are before you incorporate them into the design. Because once you incorporate them into the design, then you started the redesign process, and there's nothing you can do about that. You spent the time, the effort, the money to do that. Make sure that whatever you do change or you do update really is needed and or is totally vetted before you try to incorporate it. We often rush to fix things because we want to solve problems. We want to get through coordination as quick as possible. But sometimes we just propagate the problem forward, which doesn't really solve the problem. It creates new problems. So that's a big item I'd like to push in the concepts, is just make sure that stuff gets looked at by everybody and everybody's on board with what you're looking to try to do.
Yeah, the sooner you get more people involved at the beginning of the project, it saves so much time. I know that I don't know everything. I know Chris doesn't know everything, but it's important that we get everybody involved, because you might not see something that anybody else sees. So.
Yep. So Jay's going to do a little recap. We went through a lot. I covered a lot of topics fast, so we try to hammer home some ideas.
Yeah,
Jay.
I think the key is, you know, we talked about it during the presentation here. It's just like early and often communication, right? Start early, coordinating across all the teams, making sure that you're all on the same page. If you have quick changes, they don't require, you know, avoiding rework, and you want to, you know, keep the schedule going. Use that real data, the data that you have early in the process, so that, as Antonio just mentioned, you're looking at real information at the same time, and new ideas come out of it, so that you don't get in again that situation where, you know, you're having to do a lot of rework or RFIs. And then spend the time to do it right. You know, if you, a little planning up front will help along the way. Hit cost consistency, hit, you know, schedules and time, and then, you know, everybody has a successful project at the very end. Guys, we have quite a few questions here we can jump on real quick. If you don't mind, we can get into those. I'll read the first one if you guys can jump into it. You guys decide who jumps into it. What do you do if the client keeps changing design? Who wants to take that one?
I mean, Antonio, you want to jump in there? I mean, you're often the guy that's getting those new documents on a weekly basis.
Yeah, I would say again, documentation is important, setting deadlines, you know, when does it need to get fixed? You know, a lot of people don't set a deadline, you know, and then it gets pushed off and it gets pushed off, you know.
And,
So that's what,
and from the contract side, again, as a contractor, I mean, the other thing I talk about with this kind of stuff, if you're getting those things, make sure everybody understands the impact, the initial impact, and you get clear direction on them. Is it a price and proceed? Is it a price only? Do you want me to stop work? Make sure that you and they understand that if these things are going to continue to come, there's schedule impact, there's dollar impact. What do you really want versus, you know, is this just a, you know, a pie in the sky idea that you don't want us to necessarily run with, or do you want us to stop what we're doing and try to restart? But helping people understand the impact for those things goes a long way, and you know, understand that every time we ask Antonio to start over again, you know, there's an impact to that that's not just necessarily that scope, it's with everybody's scope, because it means he's not getting done in the time frame he needs to, and everybody else down line is also going to be impacted by that as well.
yeah, I would say that a lot of the bigger projects, they get broken up into quadrants or sections or whatever. Set deadlines for the little sections, you know, that make sure that everybody's aware, you know. Say, hey, we finished this part, but this is going to be an issue over here. We need to bring this to attention right now. You know, set times so the design team is going to be there in the meetings. So those things get brought up, and then follow-up emails are important, things like that. So
Right. Let's see, another question. How can document design changes happen without crashing all pre-existing documentation?
But I'll jump in a little on that one. So again, we understand the document design changes are inevitable. They're going to happen. So really what we try to do initially on projects is understand what the intent is, understand what the concept is before we try to incorporate it. Let's make sure that we're clear on what you're trying to do, and let's make sure that we're understanding of what you're expecting from the process, so that before we go into trying to rip things out and redo things, we make sure that as a team we understand and we can minimize the impact to the design based on what you really want. And sometimes what you put in a document may not necessarily be the easiest way to incorporate the actual end result. So we want to make sure that whatever we're doing has the least amount of impact to that kind of stuff. So we try to pre-review the changes with an owner, customer, client, engineer before the design team takes them and runs with them, to make sure that we all understand the goals and the objectives for the design change.
yeah, and let them know what the allocated time is going to be. Saying, hey, you want to make this design change, that's great, but it's going to take an extra week that could affect the schedule. You know,
Yep.
when they see those things like it's going to affect the schedule, they might rethink it, you know, or they might change their idea, you know. So
Okay, let's see, got another question coming in. How important is it to have backup on the first design or solution before making a new proposition? And how do you make that backup?
So, I mean, I'll take this. This kind of relates to contract more than design. But again, if you're on a project, assuming it's a lump sum project, an IFC set of documents. So again, if you're being issued a design change, they're issuing you some document. Hopefully it's a contractual type document that gives you some clear direction, which to me it's a means of trying to identify something. So if you're getting a document, you're getting something handed to you, that in itself is backup for what you're asking for. Now the question is, what are the impacts or the true impacts for that change, and how do you maybe document them? So I do believe that you can kind of help the owner or whomever identify the impacts that this is going to cause, the magnitude of what that you're asking them to do, and maybe the durations or schedule impact to the job as a preliminary, response, a ROM or something, to just give them some insight into what it is. Because the fact that they're giving you a document means that they're going to ask you to do something. The fact that they're giving you direction on how to proceed with it gives you direction on it being a change and or an update to the documents. But you do want to tell them, hey guys, this is this big, and this is this kind of time, and this is what it's going to do. So they can at least go into an informed decision on, yeah, this is a design change, as opposed to, hey, this is just a cleanup document that adds a little nothing to the job that we can just incorporate into the overall concept.
Got it. Here's an interesting one, Antonio, maybe you can answer. Does the BIM modeler typically have authority to make small adjustments to the project and to avoid clash?
I would say that again, it goes to those, what's the design versus redesign, If you're moving out of a room, it's going to require redesign, or at least confirming our findings, saying, hey, I moved this because of this, sign off on it. You really need to set those limits for yourself, the team, and these things should be set at the beginning of the project, So that's what I would say.
And as a contractor, I will tell you that in my opinion, if you're in coordination and you got to move something, 6 feet over in the room because it's hitting something, I don't expect a BIM modeler to come to me and say, is that okay? Again, you really want to help the process along and not necessarily bog it down. So you got to decide what's in my mind, what's a need versus a want. And there may be some needs that are really redesign needs, but again, moving things for the greater good or the betterment of the project. Usually those are things that I would expect a BIM designer to do on his own, and then just flag again, if it's a need and not a want, it has to happen. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
So just really more identify that to whomever the cost control person is, to make sure that they understood what the impact of it was. But I would assume that a BIM designer has some freedom or some leeway to move things, to adjust some of those coordination issues that come up.
Yeah, just common, this is common sense, making the right decisions with some leeway there to do it.
Yeah.
Let's see, we got a couple more coming in. Okay, what's a good tip to make a client understand where to draw the line between coordination redesign? And if we absorb too much of the redesign, we might burn the project's budget.
Again, this kind of goes back to a contractual question. As it pertains to a contractual thing as a contractor. So everybody will tell you, go into a job assuming that there's going to be some changes or some updates. I think it's clear to have I think it's good to have a clear discussion about that initially. If you're issued an IFC set of documents, it's safe to say that you assume that they're mostly vetted out. Minor changes aren't an issue. So as it pertains to trying to help them understand where those costs come into play, I think understanding the magnitude of what they are helps them understand that this is a real issue, as opposed to them thinking that it's a minor change. We often hear from, owners, oh, we just tweaked a couple things from the engineer because that's what the engineer says. And then you get into it and you find out that a couple things is every unit, and they moved them from floors, and the magnitude of those changes becomes more evident when you actually get into the design process. So I think trying to just identify them early, show the engineer, give them examples, list out that, generate a narrative of what you're seeing or what you need to do. And then durations and impacts, I think, go a long way to try to help people understand the magnitude of what you're asking for. Again, if it's going to take Antonio 3 hours to fix a model for the changes, an owner doesn't want to hear about that. But if it's going to take him 30 hours to fix that, that's something that maybe you need to flush out and talk about ahead of time.
Yeah, again, with those limits, if it's leaving the room, I always get the one, well, we just upped the size of the pipe. That's all we did, And then you realize it's from 4-inch to 6-inch with more insulation, and now it's down the corridor, and it's, you know, again, if it's a rule for me, if it's leaving the room, somebody needs to talk about it. If it's going one pipe size up, you should talk about it, you know? So set the limits for yourself, and that are for you, so you can actually say, put a little note in your note saying, oh, maybe I should talk about this.
Okay, this one just came in. We got time for a couple more here. How important is it to have backup on the first designer solution before making a new, proposition? Oh, that one is, yeah, that one came in. Okay, here it is. What is your typical work breakdown structure for BIM coordination, and how do you quantify?
That's a tough one. That's a pretty good question. You want to? I'm going to throw that one to Antonio. That's a tougher one. I'll give him the hard one.
For me, when I draw, the biggest thing is claim the space. That's for me. I try to draw as much as possible, as fast as possible, so when you do your first coordination meeting, everybody can see at a glance what they're looking at. And when you do it like that, you might catch more things right away, you know. But
And to go back to that again, we're often mechanical prime. We always look at greater good for the project. So we do think that it's important to generate a hierarchy of needs versus wants. And again, larger components typically get more preference versus a smaller component. So again, the greater good is I'm not going to move a 4-foot wide duct for a 1/2-inch water line. You start to look at some of that stuff, and you create a hierarchy or a tiered process for the installation or design, which helps minimize some of that. Or again, I understand it creates more emphasis or more issues for the guy towards the bottom of the process, but it will, you're going to have a hard time moving the big items for the little hits versus moving a little item for a big hit. And I think that hierarchy is important to establish and document going into the job, so everybody's at least aware of it. So the guy at the end of the list doesn't necessarily believe that he can just draw everything and everybody's going to move around him, because he's going to end up having to draw that again.
Right. All right. Well, we're coming up on time, and we really appreciate everyone joining us. Feel free to reach out to All Trades or E&G with more questions that you might have. You've got two experts on the line here that can help answer anything that is related to BIM coordination in the pre-construction process, and how we can help improve it within the industry. So thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks.
thanks.
Thanks.